The paper was getting wet. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the sheer audacity of the words printed on the page, not the bright red violation stamp that looked like it had been slammed down with the force of a judge sentencing a serial killer, but the simple fact that the cheap printer paper was dissolving in the drizzle. I stood at the end of my driveway, wearing nothing but a t-shirt and pajama bottoms, staring at the mailbox like it had just punched me in the gut. The sky was a slate gray, weeping a steady, pathetic mist that wasn't quite rain but was wet enough to ruin your morning. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays were supposed to be for garbage collection, not declarations of war. I wiped a droplet off the letterhead. Shadow Creek Homeowners Association. Just seeing the font made my blood pressure spike. It was Comic Sans. They used Comic Sans for their official violation notices, which was arguably a war crime in itself. I squinted at the text, hoping that perhaps the moisture on my glasses was distorting the words. It had to be a joke. One of the guys at the office must have slipped this in here as a prank. Dear homeowner, John Jax Miller, it read. It has come to the attention of the board that your property is in violation of Community Standard 4.1 regarding fluid containment and neighborly negligence. Specifically, we have documented unauthorized rainfall runoff traveling from your backyard into the adjacent property. Common Area B and 402 Maple Drive. Fine, $500. Remediation required immediately. I read it again, then a third time. Unauthorized rainfall runoff. I looked up at the sky. It was raining. I looked down at my feet. The asphalt of my driveway was wet. Gravity, being the consistent mistress she is, was pulling that water downhill. My house sat on the crest of a gentle rise in the neighborhood, a topographical feature that the realtor had sold me as commanding views, but which I now realized was a liability. Directly below me, down the slope of my backyard, sat 402 Maple Drive. Linda's house. Linda wasn't just my neighbor. She was the president of the Shadow Creek HOA, a woman who treated the neighborhood bylaws like the 10 Commandments, except she had added about 400 extra commandments and removed the one about loving thy neighbor. Linda measured grass height with a ruler. I had seen her do it. Sound. She once fined a kid for drawing with chalk on the sidewalk because the color palette clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. Unauthorized runoff, I muttered to the wet air. It's rain. It's literal rain. The sheer stupidity of it felt heavy in my chest, a physical weight. I folded the soggy paper, shoved it into my pocket, and marched back up the driveway. I didn't go inside to put on shoes. I didn't grab a jacket. I walked around the side of my house, my slippers squelching in the mud, and looked down the slope. There she was, Linda. She was standing on her back patio, protected by a screened-in enclosure, holding a cup of coffee and staring up at my property, like a general surveying a battlefield. She saw me. She didn't wave. She just took a slow sip of her coffee. That was it. I turned around, marched back to the front, and started walking down the street. I was going to 402 Maple Drive. The walk was short, but it gave me time to build up a head of steam. By the time I reached her pristine concrete driveway, which was currently wet, I might add, probably conducting unauthorized runoff into the street, I was vibrating with the righteous indignation of a man who just wanted to exist without being fined for weather. I rang the doorbell. I didn't pound on it. I rang it once, firmly. I waited. I knew she was in there. I had just seen her. The door opened. Linda stood there. She was a small woman, maybe in her early 60s, with hair so stiff with hairspray it could probably deflect small-caliber fire. She was wearing a floral blouse that looked like it had been upholstered onto her. "Jack," she said. Her voice was like grinding glass. "To what do I owe the pleasure? You're tracking mud on my porch." I looked down. My slippers were indeed leaving faint brown outlines on her welcome mat, which, ironically, said, "Live, laugh, love." "Linda," I said, pulling the soggy wad of paper from my pocket. I shook it at her. "What is this?" She squinted at the paper, then smiled. It was a terrifying smile, tight and devoid of warmth. Ah, you received the notice. The mail carrier's early today. It's a $500 fine, Linda, for rain. For runoff, she corrected, raising a finger. Unauthorized runoff. It's the same thing. I flailed a hand toward the sky. It's raining, Linda. Water falls from the sky, it hits the ground. And because physics exists, it flows downhill. I don't control the weather. Unless you think I'm doing a rain dance up there specifically to annoy you? Don't be facetious, Jack, she sighed, leaning against the doorframe. It's not about the rain. It's about management. Your backyard is sloped. When it rains, the water flows off your turf, carries silt and debris, and saturates the common area geraniums. It also dampens the foundation of my patio. Dampens your patio? It's outdoors. Patios get damp. It creates a slipping hazard, she said, her eyes narrowing. And it's unsightly. We have strict rules about fluid containment. If the water originates on your property, it is your responsibility to keep it there. I stared at her. My brain was trying to process the logic and failing. Linda, listen to yourself. If it originates on your property. It didn't originate on my property. It came from the clouds. It's transiting my property. I'm just a layover. It lands on your soil, she said, reciting it like scripture. Once it makes contact, it's yours. You own that water, Jack. And right now, your water is trespassing on my property. Trespassing water, I repeated, feeling a vein in my forehead start to throb. So, what do you want me to do? Stand out there with a shop vac every time it drizzles? Build a dome over my house? That would be an unauthorized structure, she said quickly. Bylaw 8.4, no domes. Look, Jack, it's simple. You need to fix the grade of your yard or install a drainage system that directs the water elsewhere. Until then, the fine stands. And it's a recurring fine, $500 per incident. Per incident? It's supposed to rain all week. Then I suggest you get a shovel, she said. She started to close the door. I stuck my foot out. I shouldn't have done it, but I did. My muddy slipper blocked the door jamb. Linda, I am not paying this. This is harassment. You can't find someone for gravity. She looked at my foot, then up at my face. Her expression shifted from smug to fearful in a nanosecond. A performance worthy of an Oscar. Jack, remove your foot from my door. Just take the fine back, Linda. I'm feeling threatened, she announced, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. You're aggressive, Jack. You're barging into my home. I am standing on the porch. I'm calling the police, she said, and she slammed the door. She slammed it hard enough that if I hadn't yanked my foot back, I'd be limping. I stood there for a second, stunned. Then I heard the deadbolt slide home. Then the chain lock. Then, muffled through the wood, I heard her voice. Yes, 911? I have a volatile intruder. He's refusing to leave. I threw my hands up. Unbelievable. I didn't leave. I probably should have. I should have walked away, called a lawyer, and handled it like a sane adult. But I was wet, I was broke, and I was furious. So I sat down on her porch swing. If I was going to be accused of trespassing, I might as well be comfortable. 10 minutes later, a cruiser rolled up. No sirens, thankfully. Officer Miller stepped out. I knew Miller. This was a small town, and Miller was the guy you saw at the diner every Sunday morning. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had joined the force to fight crime and save lives, only to end up mediating disputes about fence heights and barking dogs. He walked up the driveway, hitching up his belt. He saw me sitting on the swing, looking like a wet dog in pajamas. Jack, Miller sighed. Officer Miller, I nodded. Linda says you're trying to break down her door. I'm sitting on a swing, Miller. Do I look like I'm breaking anything down? Miller looked at the muddy footprint on the welcome mat. She says you blocked her door and screamed at her. I didn't scream. I projected my voice to overcome the sound of the rain. I stood up and handed him the sodden letter. Read this, please. Just read it. Miller took the paper gingerly. He scanned it. His eyebrows went up. Then they went down. He rubbed his temples. Unauthorized rainfall runoff? She fined me $500 because it's raining, Miller. She says I'm responsible for the water flowing downhill. Miller let out a long breath through his nose. He handed the paper back. Jack, look. I can't enforce HOA bylaws. I can't void them either. It's a civil matter. You gotta take it up with the board or go to small claims. But it's extortion. It's a contract, Miller said wearily. You bought the house, you signed the papers. But here's the thing. You can't be here. She wants you off the property. If you stay, I have to actually do paperwork. And I really don't want to arrest you for trespassing on a Tuesday morning. The front door creaked open just a crack. Linda's eye appeared. Is he arrested yet? Miller turned to the door. Ma'am, Mr. Miller is leaving. He was just explained the situation. There's no need for charges. He was aggressive, Linda's voice hissed. He threatened me. I threatened the rain, I shouted. Jack, Miller warned, putting a hand on my shoulder. He leaned in close, lowering his voice. Look, buddy, go home. Put on some pants. Don't yell at her. She calls us 3 times a week. Last week she called because the UPS driver wore shorts that weren't too revealing. You're not going to win a shouting match with Crazy. Beat her on paper. He gave my shoulder a squeeze. Go on now. I looked at Linda's eye in the crack of the door. I looked at Miller, who just wanted to go back to his patrol car and drink his coffee. Fine, I said. I'm going. I walked back up the hill. The rain was falling harder now. I could feel the water rushing past my ankles, flowing down the driveway, down the gutter, and yes, probably some of it was flowing into Linda's geraniums. Beat her on paper. I went inside, shucked off my wet clothes, and stood in a hot shower for 20 minutes. I was seething. It wasn't just the money. I had $500. It was the principle. It was the arrogance of it. The idea that she could legislate nature. I dried off, poured myself a finger of whiskey. It was 11 a.m., but I felt justified, and went to my study. I dug through the filing cabinet until I found the thick, dusty binder labeled Shadow Creek HOA Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, CC and Rs. I had never read it. Not really. I skimmed it when I bought the place 5 years ago, laughed at the part about mailbox colors, and signed it. Now I opened it like I was decrypting the Enigma code. I sat there for hours. The rain drummed against the window. I read about fence heights. I read about trash can placement. I read about authorized flagpoles. And then, buried in Section 14, Subsection 2, Paragraph C, I found it. The bylaw. Section 14.2. C. Fluid containment and erosion control. In the interest of preserving community aesthetics and preventing soil erosion, homeowners must retain all precipitation falling within their property lines. No homeowner shall allow excessive runoff to affect common areas or neighboring lots. Failure to contain water within the property boundaries shall constitute a violation. I stared at the words. Homeowners must retain all precipitation falling within their property lines. Linda interpreted this as, don't let water hit my patio. But as I read it, a slow, dark smile spread across my face. I read it again. Must retain all precipitation. The HOA wasn't asking me to divert the water. They weren't asking me to pipe it to the street. They were legally mandating that I keep it. They were telling me that every drop of rain that hit my dirt belonged to me, and I was forbidden from letting it leave. I sat back in my chair. The whiskey burned pleasantly in my throat. If they wanted me to keep the water, I would keep the water, all of it. I grabbed a notepad and a pen. I wasn't an engineer, but I knew basic physics. My yard was a slope. If I wanted to retain water, I couldn't just ask it to stay. I needed a barrier, a big one. I started sketching. A wall of earth, a berm, right on the property line. If I built it high enough and made it out of non-porous clay, the water wouldn't flow down to Linda's. It would pool. It would turn my backyard into a retention pond. I paused. Was that legal? I pulled up the county website on my laptop. I searched for residential water retention permits. I found a page about eco-friendly landscaping. Apparently, the county loved rain gardens. They loved on-site water sequestration. They actually offered tax credits for people who reduced load on the storm sewers. I looked back at my sketch. It was ugly. It was aggressive. It would turn my backyard into a swamp. But it was compliance. The phone rang. It was the automated HOA notification system. This is a reminder from Shadow Creek HOA. A fine of $500 has been assessed to your account. Please pay within 30 days to avoid late fees." I hung up. I needed a professional. I needed someone who knew dirt, knew water, and hated HOAs. I pulled up a local business directory and found a listing for S. Jenkins, Civil Engineering and Hydrology Consulting. The website was bare bones. No, just a phone number and a promise. "We make water go where you want it." I dialed. "Jenkins Engineering," a woman's voice answered. She sounded like she was eating a sandwich. "Hi," I said. "My name is Jack. I have a weird question." "I charge for weird questions," she said. "But try me. My HOA is fining me for rainfall runoff. They say I have to retain all precipitation on my property. I want to know, can I build a dam?" The chewing stopped. "A dam? In a subdivision?" "A berm, along the property line, to catch everything. I want zero runoff. I want to follow their rules so hard they choke on them." There was a silence on the line. Then a low chuckle. "Sir, do you have any idea how much water a quarter-acre lot collects in a heavy storm?" "I'm hoping the answer is a lot." "I'm listening," she said. "When can I come over?" Sarah Jenkins rolled up to my house the next morning in a beat-up Ford F-150 that looked like it had survived a rock slide. She hopped out, wearing steel-toed boots and a neon vest over a flannel shirt. She looked to be about 30, with eyes that were sharp and assessing. She didn't look at me. She looked at the ground. "Nice slope," she said, slamming the truck door. "Classic suburban grade. Terrible for drainage, great for sledding." "I'm Jack," I said, extending a hand. She shook it firmly. "Sarah, show me the war zone." I led her to the backyard. The rain had stopped for the moment, leaving the grass squishy and slick. We walked down to the fence line, a flimsy wooden thing that separated my kingdom from Linda's. "Okay," Sarah said, putting hands on her hips. "So, the lady down there," she gestured to Linda's house, "is complaining about the water coming down?" "She fined me," I said. $500. She cited this. I handed her the printout of Bylaw 14.2. See, Sarah read it. Her eyebrows climbed up her forehead. Then she laughed. It was a loud, barking laugh that startled a cardinal out of a nearby tree. "Retain all precipitation?" she wheezed. "Do they know what that means? Legally? Hydrologically?" "I assume they mean it don't get Linda's patio wet." "Words matter, Jack," Sarah grinned, tapping the paper. "In engineering, retain means store. It means you become a reservoir. If you follow this to the letter, you are legally required to stop the natural hydrological cycle of this hillside." "Can we do it?" Sarah looked at the fence. She looked back up at my house. Tum. She pulled a laser rangefinder out of her pocket and took a few measurements. She crouched down, dug her finger into the soil, and rubbed the dirt between her thumb and forefinger. "Heavy clay content," she muttered. "That's good. Clay doesn't drain well. It seals." She stood up and turned to me. "Technically, yes. We can build a berm, an earthen levee. We strip the topsoil, bring in some heavy, compacted clay, build a wall right here about 3 feet high. Maybe 4, just to be safe. We grade the rest of your yard backward, creating a negative slope toward the center." "What happens when it rains?" "Your yard fills up," she said simply, "like a bathtub. The berm stops the water from going to Linda. The water stays here." "And that's legal?" "The county loves it," she said, her eyes twinkling. "They call it a rain garden or a bioretention cell. It's green infrastructure. You're preventing storm sewer overload. You're recharging the local aquifer. You're an environmental hero, Jack." "And Linda?" Sarah looked down at Linda's house. The foundation was maybe 10 feet lower in elevation than where we were standing. "Well," Sarah said, her voice dropping a register, "here's the thing about water, Jack. You can stop it from flowing over the ground. That's what the berm does. But you can't really stop it from pushing down. If you have a standing pool of water 3 feet deep right here." She stomped on the property line. That creates hydrostatic pressure. A lot of it. That water is going to push down into the soil. It's going to saturate the water table." She looked at me. "Where do you think that groundwater goes?" I looked at Linda's basement windows, which were barely visible above the ground level. Down? Down and sideways, Sarah confirmed, directly toward the path of least resistance. If her foundation isn't waterproofed to military standards, and trust me, it's not, her sump pump is going to have a heart attack trying to keep up. But the water won't be run off, I said. It won't be crossing the property line on the surface. Nope, Sarah popped the P. Surface runoff is 0. You are in total compliance with bylaw 14.2. C. What happens underground? That's just geology, baby. How much will it cost? A few thousand for the dirt work. Another 500 for my permit drawings. I can have the plans ready by tomorrow. Do it, I said. Sarah spent the next hour taking detailed survey measurements. She was humming the whole time. I went back inside to make more coffee. While I was brewing, I saw movement out the window. Linda was in her yard, holding a camera. She was taking pictures of Sarah. I opened the sliding door and stepped out onto the deck. Morning, Linda, I called out. Linda lowered the camera. What is going on? Who is that? That's a surveyor, I shouted back cheerily. I'm taking your advice. I'm fixing the runoff issue. Linda looked suspicious, but also smug. She clearly thought I was installing a drain pipe to the street, which would have cost me 10 grand and ripped up my driveway. Good to see you taking responsibility, Jack. Finally. Oh, I'm taking it all, I muttered. 2 days later, I was standing at the counter of the county clerk's office. I had Sarah's blueprints in a tube. They were labeled Residential Water Conservation and Bioretention Project. The clerk, a guy named Ted who looked like he'd been stamping forms since the Reagan administration, unrolled the plans. He adjusted his glasses. That's a big berm, Ted noted. I'm very passionate about the environment, Ted, I said solemnly. I want to capture every drop. For the aquifer. Ted looked at the projected volume numbers. You're creating a retention pond in a subdivision. Usually people want to get rid of water. My HOA is very strict, I said. They require total containment. Bylaw 14.2. C. I showed him the letter. Ted read the HOA letter. He let out a snort. Total containment? These HOA people are morons. If you do this, you're going to turn your yard into a mosquito pit. I'll stock it with fish if I have to. Is it legal? Ted checked his code book. Setbacks are clear. Height is under the limit for a fence. It's not a permanent structure. Erosion control plan is solid. He shrugged. Technically, you're improving the county drainage situation. We don't have to process the water if you keep it. He grabbed a stamp. Ka-chunk. Approved, Ted said. Good luck with the mosquitoes. I walked out of that office, feeling like I had just stolen the crown jewels. I had a permit, I had a plan, and I had a vendetta. When I got home, there was another envelope in my mailbox, Comic Sans font. Second notice, violation of Standard 4.1. The violation has not been remediated. A second fine of $500 has been assessed. Total due, $1,000. Continued non-compliance will result in a lien being placed on the property. I walked into the house, taped the permit to the inside of my front window facing the street, and picked up the phone. I called Sarah. We got the green light, I said. When can the bulldozers start? My guy Bill is free on Thursday, she said. He loves moving dirt, but warned he's loud. The louder the better, I said. I poured myself a glass of water. I drank it. Then I looked out at the sunny sky. Enjoy the dry weather while it lasts, Linda, because the forecast says rain is coming, and this time I'm keeping it all. Thursday morning arrived with the subtle grace of a monster truck rally. At 7 a.m. sharp, a flatbed trailer rumbled down our quiet suburban street. On the back sat a medium-sized excavator and a skid steer loader. The driver, a man who looked like he was carved out of granite and beef jerky, leaned out the window and spat something into a cup. This was Bill. He parked the rig in front of my house, blocking half the street. The air brakes hissed loudly, a sound that echoed through the neighborhood like a dragon waking up. I walked out to meet him. Bill hopped down. He was wearing a shirt that said, "I dig holes," and a hard hat that had seen better decades. "You Jack?" he grunted. "I'm Jack. You, Bill? Yep, Sarah sent the prints. You want a 3-foot clay berm along the rear easement, negative grade on the yard, French drain cycling back to center. Weirdest job I've had in a month. We aim to please, I said. Can you get that thing in the backyard? I can get this thing in a bathroom if I have to, Bill said, patting the excavator. Let's make a mess. He fired up the machine. The diesel engine roared to life, clattering and smoking. He rolled it off the trailer, the metal tracks chewing up a little bit of the asphalt edge on my driveway. I didn't care. As Bill navigated the machine around the side of my house, crushing a few of my own azalea bushes in the process, the inevitable happened. Linda came out. She didn't just walk out. She burst onto her patio like she had been shot out of a cannon. She was wearing a silk bathrobe and fuzzy slippers, and she was already screaming before she even got the door open. "What is this noise?" she shrieked. Her voice was impressive. It actually cut through the sound of the diesel engine. Bill stopped the excavator. He idled the engine down, opened the cab door, and looked at me. "That the neighbor?" "That's her," I said. I walked to the edge of the slope. "Good morning, Linda." "Jack!" she yelled, pointing a trembling finger at the heavy machinery. "What is that monstrosity? It is 7:15 in the morning. There are noise ordinances. There are construction bylaws." "Actually," I said, pulling a folded document from my back pocket, "city ordinance allows construction noise starting at 7 a.m. on weekdays. We waited 15 minutes just to be polite." "You are destroying the peace of this neighborhood. What are you doing?" "Compliance, Linda," I shouted, waving the paper. "I'm complying with Bylaw 14. 2.c exclamation mark, I'm building a fluid containment system to prevent unauthorized runoff." She paused. The gears were turning in her head. She looked at the excavator, then back at me. A smug, satisfied look washed over her face. She smoothed her bathrobe. "Well," she said, loud enough for Bill to hear, "it's about time you took this seriously. I suppose a little noise is the price of progress. Make sure they don't damage the fence." "We wouldn't dream of it," I said. She went back inside, presumably to watch from behind her blinds and gloat. "She seems nice," Bill deadpanned. "She fined me $1,000 for rain, Bill." Bill's face darkened. He shifted a toothpick in his mouth. "Is that so?" He looked at Linda's house, then back at the controls of his machine. He cranked the throttle up to maximum. The engine roared like a jet taking off. "Let's dig." The next 8 hours were a symphony of destruction. Bill didn't just move dirt, he sculpted it. First, he stripped the top layer of sod from the back half of my yard, piling it up in a messy heap. Then, a dump truck arrived, another massive, noisy vehicle, and dumped 5 tons of heavy, non-porous red clay right in my driveway. Bill used the skid steer to shuttle the clay to the backyard. He began packing it along the fence line, layer by layer. He used the bucket of the excavator to smash it down, compressing it into a solid, impermeable wall. It rose 1 foot, then 2, then 3. It looked like an ugly brown scar running the entire width of my property. Linda came out a few times to inspect. She stood on her patio, hands on her hips. She seemed confused by the fact that the dirt was going up, not down, but she didn't say anything. She probably assumed I was building a planter. By 3 p.m., the great wall of dirt was finished. It was ugly. It was magnificent. Bill had graded the rest of the yard so that it sloped gently away from my house and towards the wall. It was a perfect bowl. Bill killed the engine and climbed down. He was covered in red dust. He walked over to the edge of the berm and looked down at Linda's house. He spit on the ground. "Hey, boss," he said. "Yeah, Bill?" "You know, looking at this grade..." He pointed a thick finger at the berm. "This clay is packed tight. It'll hold water like a swimming pool. But once you get a foot or 2 of standing water in here, that's a lot of weight." "I know." "The ground underneath is softer, loamy soil," Bill continued. "The water won't go through the clay berm, but it's going to push down. It's going to saturate the soil underneath, and gravity being what it is..." He traced a line with his finger from the center of my yard, underneath the berm, directly to Linda's foundation. "It's going to squeeze the water table right under her slab. If she's got any cracks in her basement walls, or if her sump pump is old. Bill, I interrupted. Are you a geologist? Bill looked at me. A slow grin spread across his dusty face. Nope, I just move dirt. Exactly, I said. Dig it a little deeper in the middle. Bill laughed. It was a terrifying sound. You got it. He hopped back in the machine. He spent the next hour carving out the center of the yard, making the bowl even more pronounced. By the time he was done, my backyard looked like a bomb crater. It was a barren, grassless depression surrounded by a wall of red mud. We finished up around 5 p.m. I wrote Bill a check. He shook my hand. Hope it rains soon, Bill said, winking. Me too, Bill. Me too. I stood on my deck and looked at the devastation. My property value had probably just dropped by 20%. It looked hideous. It looked like a construction site that had been abandoned. Linda came out again. She walked up to the fence, which was now partially obscured by the berm on my side, and peered over. Jack, she called out. Yes, Linda? What have you done to your yard? It's dirt. It's unsightly. It's a bioretention cell, Linda. It takes time for the native grasses to grow in. But don't worry, the functionality is 100%. Well, it looks terrible. I might have to look into a fine for unsightly landscaping. You do that, I said. But check the Xeriscaping Act first, or talk to the county. They approved the permit. I pointed to the orange permit sticker on my window. She glared at the permit, then at the mud wall. Well, as long as the water stays off my patio. Oh, it will, I promised. Not a drop will cross this line. I went inside and checked the weather forecast. The clear skies were holding for now. But there was a system developing off the coast, a big one, an atmospheric river, the weathermen were calling it. I cracked a beer and sat by the window, watching the sun go down over my glorious, muddy, empty swimming pool. The trap was set. Now, we just needed the act of God. The universe has a twisted sense of humor. For 3 weeks, not a single drop of rain fell. My yard was a desolate wasteland of hardened red clay. It began to crack in the sun. It looked like the surface of Mars, if Mars were located in a cul-de-sac and governed by a tyrant in a floral blouse. Linda did not waste this opportunity. Every day she found a way to remind me of my folly. She would bring other board members by on neighborhood walks. They would pause at the bottom of the hill, point up at my berm, and shake their heads. I could hear them. Tragic. Really, Linda would say loudly. He ruined his property value just to be stubborn. Does he think he's growing potatoes? Another board member, a guy named Greg who wore polo shirts tucked into cargo shorts, asked. It's a sore on the community, Linda sighed. I received a notice in the mail. Violation of Standard 6.3, unsightly landscaping, fine, $200. I didn't even get mad this time. I just stapled a copy of my county permit to the fine and mailed it back with a note. Work in progress, county-approved conservation project. I attended the monthly HOA meeting at the community center. I sat in the back. When the floor opened for new business, Linda immediately brought up my yard. We have a situation on Maple Drive, she announced to the room of 20 bored homeowners. Mr. Miller has turned his backyard into a mud pit. The board is moving to take action. I stood up. Action? It's ugly, Jack, Greg said from the dais. It violates the aesthetic harmony. I have a county permit, I said, holding it up. It's a federally recognized water conservation effort. Under the Xeriscaping and Water Conservation Act, the HOA cannot prohibit landscaping that conserves water or reduces runoff. If you fine me for this, I will sue the HOA for discrimination against environmental practices. The room went quiet. The board members exchanged glances. They knew the law was tricky on this stuff. Linda narrowed her eyes. Fine, keep your mud pit. But winter is coming, Jack. When the frost hits, that clay is going to heave. You'll regret this. I'm sure I will, I said. I walked out, but as I left, I felt a twinge of anxiety. If it didn't rain soon, the clay might dry out too much. It might crumble. I needed moisture. I went home and checked the long-range forecast again. My breath hitched. The atmospheric river wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was a certainty. The National Weather Service had issued a hydrologic outlook. A massive low-pressure system was barreling in from the Pacific, loaded with tropical moisture. They were predicting 4 to 6 inches of rain over a 48-hour period. In our area, that was a biblical deluge. I texted Sarah. "Storm's coming, 6 inches. Will it hold?" She texted back immediately. "The berm? Yes. The ground saturation? It's going to be juicy. Good luck." I texted Bill. "Showtime." Bill replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a beer mug emoji. 2 days before the storm, I went to the grocery store. I bought popcorn, I bought whiskey, I bought a new raincoat. I spent the day before the storm inspecting the berm. I walked the length of it, tapping the clay with a shovel. It was hard as concrete. I checked the French drain inlets. Clear. Linda was in her yard, covering her patio furniture with tarps. She saw me patrolling my mud wall. "Looks like rain, Jack," she yelled, struggling with a bungee cord. "Hope your little wall holds." "It's engineered, Linda," I yelled back. "State of the art. If one drop of mud comes onto my patio, I'm suing you. If it does, you have my permission." I went inside and waited. The sky turned a bruised purple. The wind picked up. The trees began to sway. At 8 p.m., the first drops hit the window. Tip, tap, tip, tap. Then the heavens opened. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a curtain of water. It pounded the roof. Sounded like gravel being thrown against the siding. I turned on the exterior floodlights and watched the backyard. The dry, cracked clay bottom of my pool turned dark red. Puddles formed. They joined together. By midnight, the entire floor of the basin was covered in an inch of water. By 3 a.m., it was 3 inches. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I listened to the rain. It was relentless. It was the sound of Bylaw 14.2, C being enforced. "Must retain all precipitation." I whispered it into the dark. "I'm retaining it, Linda. I'm retaining it all." Day 1 was impressive. Day 2 was catastrophic. I woke up and went straight to the window. It was still pouring. A gray sheet of water obscured the trees. I looked down at the backyard. It was a lake. The water level had risen significantly. It was easily a foot deep in the center of the depression and creeping up the sides of the berm. The muddy brown water swirled with the intensity of the downpour. And the berm? The berm was a champion. It stood firm, a thick brown line holding back the tide. On the other side of the berm, Linda's yard was wet, sure, but there were no streams of water flowing from my property. I was in total compliance. I made coffee and sat by the sliding glass door, watching the water level rise. I marked it mentally against the fence posts. 6 inches? 8 inches. By noon on the second day, we were approaching 18 inches of standing water. That's thousands of gallons. That is an immense amount of weight pressing down on the soil. I grabbed my binoculars and trained them on Linda's house. Her backyard was soggy, puddles forming in the usual low spots. But then I noticed something. A hose was snaking out of her basement window. Water was spurting out of it in a rhythmic chug, chug, chug. Her sump pump was running. I smiled. The pump was working hard. It was handling the normal rain. But it hadn't yet felt the pressure of Lake Jack. As the afternoon wore on, the rain intensified. The news said we were at 5 inches total accumulation. My yard was now holding nearly 2 feet of water in the deepest section. That was when the physics kicked in. The water in my yard couldn't go sideways. It couldn't go over the berm. So slowly, relentlessly, it was pushing down. It was forcing the groundwater deeper, displacing the water table, and shoving it downhill, right under the berm, right into the soil surrounding Linda's basement. At 4 p.m., I saw a van pull up to Linda's house. "There's emergency plumbing." I took a sip of coffee. "Here we go." The plumber ran inside with a tool bag. He came out 20 minutes later, shaking his head. He went to the truck, got a bigger pump, and ran back inside. At 6 p.m., the rain showed no sign of stopping. I saw Linda come out the back door. She was wearing a yellow raincoat and holding a large umbrella. She looked frantic. She ran to the hose coming out of the basement. It was flowing full bore now, a fire hose of water, but it clearly wasn't enough. She looked up the hill. She looked at the berm. She stormed toward the property line. She was slipping in the mud, flailing her arms. I opened my door and stepped out onto the deck. I stayed under the overhang. "Jack!" she screamed. Her voice was shrill, panicked. "Jack!" "Hey, Linda. Wet enough for you?" "You have to open it," she shrieked. "Open the wall! Let the water out!" "What?" I cupped my ear. "I can't hear you over the authorized precipitation." "My basement!" she yelled, gesturing wildly at her house. "It's flooding. The water is coming through the walls. The sump pump can't keep up. You have to break the berm." I shook my head sadly. "I can't do that, Linda." "Why not?" "Bylaw 14, 2.c exclamation mark," I shouted back. "If I breach the berm, I'll be releasing unauthorized runoff. I'd be in violation. It's a $500 fine, Linda. I can't afford that." "I don't care about the fine," she screamed, actually stomping her foot in a puddle. "My carpet is floating. Open the damn wall." "I need that in writing," I yelled. "I need a signed letter from the entire board authorizing a variance to the bylaws. Otherwise, my hands are tied." "Are you insane?" "I'm compliant." She stared at me, mouth agape, rain dripping off her nose. Then, she did the unthinkable. She turned around, ran back to her garage, and came out with a shovel. She marched up to the berm, my berm on my property line, and raised the shovel. "Linda, don't do it," I warned. "That's destruction of private property." She swung the shovel. Thwack! It hit the clay. It barely made a dent. The clay was packed tight. She swung again. She was manic, hacking at the wall of mud. I pulled out my phone. I didn't call the police. I didn't have to. Because just then, headlights swept across the cul-de-sac. Officer Miller. Linda must have called him earlier, probably when the water first started coming in. Miller stepped out of his car, wearing a heavy raincoat. He walked into my driveway, then down the side of the house toward the commotion. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," Miller shouted, seeing Linda attacking my dirt wall. "Ma'am, drop the shovel." Linda froze. She turned to Miller, wild-eyed. "Officer, arrest him! He's flooding my house! He's drowning me!" Miller looked at her. Then he looked at me, standing dry on my deck. Then he looked at the berm. Then he looked at the massive lake in my backyard. "He's not touching your house, ma'am," Miller said. "He's standing on his porch." "His water!" she screamed. "He's holding all this water and it's pushing into my basement. It's hydrostatic pressure. It's malice." Miller walked up to the edge of the berm. He looked at the water contained perfectly within my property lines. "Jack!" Miller shouted over the rain. "You got a permit for this?" "Taped to the front window." "Officer," I replied, "and I'm strictly following HOA Bylaw 14.2, C regarding fluid containment." Miller looked at Linda. "Ma'am, put the shovel down. You're destroying his landscaping." "He's destroying my home," Linda sobbed. "Please, make him open it." Miller sighed. He looked at me. "Jack, can you help her out?" "Officer," I said, keeping my voice calm and loud, "I would love to help, but the HOA has fined me twice for runoff. Unless the president of the HOA," I pointed at Linda, "declares this bylaw null and void in writing right now, I cannot legally release this water without incurring liability." Miller looked at Linda. "Well, ma'am, can you write that?" I, Linda stammered. "I can't just void a bylaw. It requires a quorum, a vote." "Then I guess the water stays," I said. Linda let out a sound that was half scream, half gurgle. She dropped the shovel. She looked at her house, where the plumber was now bringing out buckets of water because the pump had failed. "I'm going to sue you," she screamed at me. "I'm going to take everything." "Get in line," I said. Miller escorted a sobbing, defeated Linda back to her drowning house. He looked back at me one last time. He tipped his hat. I swear, under the brim, he was smiling. The rain finally stopped on a Thursday morning. It didn't taper off, it just quit, as if the sky had run out of ammunition. The sun broke through the clouds with a cheerful, mocking brilliance, illuminating the disaster zone that was 402 Maple Drive. My backyard, affectionately dubbed Lake Jack, took 3 days to drain. The heavy clay soil held onto that water like a miser hoarding pennies. But eventually the water level dropped, leaving behind a slick, mud-cracked depression that looked like a buffalo wallow. Downhill, however, things were not drying out. The morning after the storm, a convoy of white vans descended on Linda's driveway. ServPro, Roto-Rooter, Mold Busters. They looked like a hazmat team preparing for a biological event. I stood on my deck, sipping coffee, watching men in Tyvek suits carry out sodden rolls of carpet, ruinous drywall, and furniture that had swelled to twice its normal size. The smell wafted up the hill. It was the distinct, earthy, nose-wrinkling scent of wet basement and mildew. It smelled like victory. Linda was outside, pacing back and forth, screaming into her cell phone. She saw me. She stopped pacing. She stared at me with a hatred so pure it could have melted steel beams. I raised my mug in a silent toast. She turned her back and kicked a piece of wet padding. I knew it wasn't over. The water had receded, but the paper storm was just beginning. 3 days later, a process server knocked on my door. He was a polite young man who looked like he'd rather be doing literally anything else. "John Miller? That's me. You've been served." He handed me a thick envelope. I didn't even have to open it to know what it was. Linda V. Miller. A civil lawsuit seeking damages for property destruction, negligence, emotional distress, and, my personal favorite, malicious alteration of natural topography. She was suing me for $150,000. I called my insurance company. They sent a lawyer, a guy named Robert, who wore expensive suits and had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I liked him immediately. I also called Sarah, my engineer, and Bill, my contractor. "You're getting sued?" Sarah asked over the phone. She sounded delighted. "Can I be an expert witness? I've always wanted to explain Darcy's law to a jury." "You're hired," I said. The legal process moved slower than a glacier, but Linda pushed for an expedited deposition. She wanted blood, and she wanted it now. We met in a conference room in downtown. On one side of the mahogany table sat Linda, looking haggard and vindictive, flanked by a lawyer who looked like a bulldog in a cheap suit. On my side sat Robert, myself, and a stack of documents 3 inches thick. Linda's lawyer started aggressively. He turned on a video camera and pointed a finger at me. "Mr. Miller," he barked, "did you or did you not construct an earthen berm on your property with the specific intention of diverting water into my client's basement?" I leaned into the microphone. "No." "No?" The lawyer scoffed. "You built a wall. The water pooled. The water flooded her house, cause and effect. You're telling me you didn't know that would happen?" "I'm telling you I built a fluid containment system," I corrected. "I constructed a bioretention cell in strict compliance with the Shadow Creek HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions." "This isn't about the HOA," the lawyer snapped. "This is about negligence." "It is entirely about the HOA," Robert interjected smoothly. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was the original violation letter, the one with the Comic Sans font. "Exhibit A," Robert said. On October 12th, the plaintiff, acting in her capacity as HOA president, fined Mr. Miller for unauthorized rainfall runoff. She specifically cited Section 14.2. C. Robert slid another paper across. The bylaws. Section 14.2. C states, "Homeowners must retain all precipitation falling within their property lines." Mr. Miller was simply complying with a direct order from the plaintiff. He was fined twice for failing to do so. He remediated the issue by retaining the precipitation. All of it. Linda's lawyer frowned. He picked up the letter. He looked at Linda. "You fined him for letting water run downhill?" Linda bristled. "He was muddying my patio. It was a nuisance. He had a responsibility to manage his water." "And he did," Robert said. "He managed it right there on his property. He didn't let a drop cross the surface line. That's what the berm did." "But the groundwater," Linda shrieked, unable to stay quiet. "He forced the water underground. He knew it would crush my foundation." Sarah, who was sitting in the back of the room waiting for her turn, cleared her throat. Robert nodded to her. "If I may." Sarah said, stepping up. She unrolled a large diagram. It showed the soil strata, the water table, and the vector forces of hydrostatic pressure. It looked very scientific. It looked irrefutable. "This is a cross-section of the hillside," Sarah explained, pointing with a pen. "Before the berm, the water flowed naturally over the surface. This is the safest way for water to move during a heavy storm. However, Miss Linda prohibited this natural flow. By mandating retention, she effectively demanded the creation of a localized aquifer." Sarah looked at Linda's lawyer. "Any civil engineer would tell you that if you hold 10,000 gallons of water on a porous clay slope, the hydraulic head, that's the pressure, has to go somewhere. It went down. It followed the path of least resistance, which was the unwaterproofed cinder block foundation of the plaintiff's home." "So it is his fault," Linda yelled. "No," Sarah said calmly. "It's physics, and since Mr. Miller was legally compelled by the HOA to stop the surface flow, the resulting subsurface flow is the direct result of the HOA's mandate. Mr. Miller didn't have a choice. If he opened the berm, he would be fined. If he kept it closed, you flooded. He chose to avoid the fine." Robert smiled. It was a shark's smile. "In legal terms, this is called estoppel. You can't order someone to do something and then sue them for the natural consequences of doing exactly what you ordered." Linda's lawyer went pale. He whispered something to Linda. Linda shook her head violently. "I want him to pay," she hissed. "There's one more thing," Robert said, pulling out a final document. "This lawsuit names Mr. Miller as the defendant, but the directive to build the retention system came from the HOA board. Linda was acting as president when she issued the fines. Therefore, she wasn't acting as a private neighbor, but as an officer of the corporation." He leaned back. "If there is liability here, and we argue there isn't, it belongs to the Shadow Creek Homeowners Association. And since Linda is the president, she essentially flooded her own house by enforcing a defective bylaw." The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner. "We're done here," Linda's lawyer said, closing his briefcase. "We need to recess." The lawsuit didn't go to trial. It didn't even make it to a hearing. Linda's lawyer realized that if they pushed this, the HOA's insurance policy would be on the hook. And since Linda was the HOA, she was effectively suing herself for incompetence. The case was dismissed with prejudice, but the damage was done. Not just to the basement, but to the bank account. The HOA's insurance provider got wind of the incident, specifically the fact that a board member's enforcement of a nonsensical bylaw caused $150,000 in damages. Insurance companies don't like losing money. They reacted swiftly. A month later, every homeowner in Shadow Creek received a letter. It wasn't in Comic Sans. It was in standard, terrifying Times New Roman. Notice of special assessment. Due to a sharp increase in our liability insurance premiums following a recent claim event involving board governance, the annual HOA dues will be increasing by $1,200 per household, effectively immediately. Additionally, a one-time assessment of $500 is required to cover legal fees incurred during the recent dispute. The neighborhood exploded. If there is one thing that unites suburbanites more than their hatred of weeds, it is their hatred of losing money. The Facebook group page, usually reserved for complaints about dog poop and suspicious vans, turned into a digital riot. People were furious. They demanded answers. Why were they paying $1,700 extra this year? What claim event? Someone, I won't say who, but his name rhymes with Jack Miller, anonymously posted a PDF of the deposition transcript to the group. The thread caught fire. Wait, so Linda flooded herself because she made Jack build a mud wall? We're paying for Linda's wet carpet because she doesn't understand gravity? I'm looking at bylaw 14.2. C right now. This is insane. Who wrote this? The torches were lit. The pitchforks were sharpened. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Usually 3 people showed up. Tonight there were 50. People were standing in the hallway. Linda sat at the head table, looking small and brittle. She tried to bang her gavel to bring the meeting to order. "Order! Order!" she shouted. "You're out of order, Linda!" a guy from 3 streets over yelled. "You cost me $1,700. "I was enforcing the rules," Linda stammered. "Mr. Miller was non-compliant." "Mr. Miller saved us from a lawsuit," a woman shouted. "If he hadn't complied, you'd still be fining him, and we'd still be paying for your lawyers." Greg, the board member who had mocked my yard, tried to intervene. "Now everyone, let's be civil. We're all neighbors here." "Motion to remove the president," someone shouted from the back. "Seconded," screamed half the room. Linda stood up, her face a mask of shock. "You can't do that. I founded this board. I wrote these rules." "Then you can unwrite them from your living room." The vote was unanimous. It was a bloodbath. Linda was stripped of her title, her gavel, and her dignity in under 10 minutes. The entire board was dissolved. A new board was elected on the spot. The new president was a guy named Dave. A chill dad who brewed his own beer and generally didn't care if your grass was half an inch too long. Dave's first act as president? He looked at me. "Jack," Dave said, "motion to strike bylaw 14.2. See regarding fluid containment?" "I second that motion," I said. "All in favor?" "Aye," the room roared. "Motion carries," Dave said. "Gravity is legal again." 2 weeks later, the white vans were finally gone from Linda's driveway. Her basement was gutted and dry, but her spirit seemed permanently dampened. She didn't come out on her patio much anymore. When she did, she didn't look up the hill. It was a Saturday. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the rumble of a diesel engine once again filled the air. Bill was back. He parked the excavator in my driveway. "Ready to fix this mess?" he asked, looking at the crater in my backyard. "Yeah, Bill, fill it in." Bill spent the day pushing the berm back into the hole. He leveled the clay, spread the topsoil back over it, and graded it perfectly. He didn't create a bowl this time. He created a gentle, natural slope that led right down to the property line. When he was done, he shut off the machine. We stood on the deck, looking at the fresh brown earth. It was flat. It was normal. "You gonna plant grass?" Bill asked. "Eventually," I said. "Maybe some wildflowers. Something that likes water?" Bill chuckled. "You know, if you leave it like this, the next time it rains, the water will flow downhill," I finished. "Just like nature intended." I handed Bill a beer. We clinked bottles. Just then, Linda's back door opened. She stepped out. She looked up at us. She looked at the leveled ground. She looked at the sky, which was perfectly clear. She opened her mouth to say something. Maybe a complaint about the noise, maybe a warning about the dust. But then she stopped. She looked at her basement windows. She seemed to remember the sound of 10,000 gallons of water rushing through her drywall. She closed her mouth. She turned around and went back inside. I took a sip of beer. It tasted fantastic. "You know, Bill," I said, watching the sun dip below the trees, "they say you can't fight City Hall." Bill wiped sweat from his forehead. "They say that?" "But," I smiled, looking at the spot where the Great Wall of Mud once stood, "nobody ever said you can't drown the HOA."